Were you General Secretary of the editorial board at that time when that was published?
No, I wasn't even a member of the editorial board.
So there's an election coming up on June 8th in the UK to pick the next Prime Minister. So right now the top contenders are the current Prime Minister, Theresa May, who's of the Conservative Party. And then there's also Jeremy Corbyn, who represents the Labour Party. So Jeremy Corbyn right now is being painted as this far crazy leftist, mainly by people who are wealthy and powerful. So if you aren't that familiar with Jeremy Corbyn, think Bernie Sanders, but a bit more left. So you can understand why the media in the UK aren't all that happy with Jeremy Corbyn at the moment. And right now his numbers are actually rising. So he was at one point 20 points below in polls behind Theresa May, and now he's within 10 points. And with the election on June 8th, there's a couple weeks there to really pick up and really give May a challenge. So it's going to be very interesting to see what happens. But right now, I want to cover this interview that Jeremy Corbyn was in. So Jeremy Corbyn was being interviewed by Sophy Ridge on Sky News. And I don't think she quite expected Corbyn to respond the way he did to this question.
I'm interested in the kind of issues of your sort of character, your personality, because you're asking people to vote for you to be the next Prime Minister of the UK. So I just want to show you this editorial. Now, this is taken from the Labour Briefing magazine back in December 1984. Were you General Secretary of the editorial board at that time when that was published?
No, I wasn't even a member of the editorial board.
You weren't a member of the editorial board because, according to parliamentary profiles by Andrew Roth, authoritative...
Andrew Roth has a wonderful reputation for having the most inaccurate parliamentary profiles known to anyone.
So you were not a member of the editorial board of that magazine in December 1984? Categorically not?
I read the magazine, I wrote for the magazine, I was not a member of the editorial board.
Okay.
So I love this clip because Sophy Ridge looks so excited to hand Jeremy Corbyn this clipping from Labour Briefing magazine, only to find out that he wasn't on the editorial board and that he had nothing to do with the article. So he quickly shuts it down. And look, there's nothing wrong with asking hard questions. Journalists should ask hard questions. They should do some digging and ask questions that matter. The problem here is that this is not like a policy-based question. This is a clipping from 35 years ago from a magazine that Jeremy Corbyn had written articles for, but it wasn't even his article. So I'm going to get more into how ridiculous it is to dive into someone's history like that if you have nothing else to go on. But let me play the second part of this clip, and then I'm really going to go deep on it.
What it says in the article, just in the wake of the Brighton bombing, an attack by the IRA, of course, intended to kill Margaret Thatcher, which killed 5 people, the British only sit up and take notice when they are bombed into it. How does that make you feel, knowing that you wrote for that magazine?
I didn't agree with it. I don't agree with that position. I've always wanted there to be peace in Ireland. I've always wanted there to be an accord, and eventually in 1994 a ceasefire was agreed. That one disappeared, but the second ceasefire came in 1997. I've always wanted there to be peace, and I really welcome the Good Friday Agreement and all the achievements that it's made since then.
So why did you continue to write for that magazine then?
I wrote for the magazine on many issues because it's a magazine that reaches a number of people within the Labour Party and the Labour movement. There are many things in many papers and many magazines with which I profoundly disagree. Does that mean I don't engage? There are programmes on your station that I don't really agree with. You probably don't agree with them either. Isn't that what open debate and journalism is about? Now, sometimes listening to people that you don't agree with does you good.
Oh man. So Jeremy Corbyn just completely destroys Sophy Ridge in that question. And just it's kind of sad to begin with because she was already neutered going into the question because he had already said I had nothing to do with that article. I wasn't on the editorial board. I just wrote for the magazine. But she already has this thing set up, so she has to continue on to the question, and so she asked the question, fine. But then, because she's grasping at straws and trying to figure out a way to pin him down, she asks him, so why did you still write for the magazine? Really? Why does it matter? Like he said, do you agree with everything on your network? Does every writer at every newspaper agree with everything everybody else says? Or every magazine? Is every magazine, newspaper, and television station a hive mind where you're all just one brain? No, people have different opinions. They have different perspectives, and then they come together and they share those ideas within their medium, whether it's a newspaper, a magazine, a TV show, news, whatever it is. That's kind of the point, is to have different perspectives. For example, the New York Times just hired Bret Stephens, who is a kind of a climate change denier, or at least he has questions around climate change. I don't want to call him a denier outright, but he questions things that the scientific community has sort of already resolved. Now, does that mean the entire New York Times now don't believe in climate change because that one writer is on? No. And look, there's other arguments for why maybe he shouldn't be on New York Times. But in general, when you're talking about perspectives and opinions, not everybody's going to agree. So, I mean, she really only asked that question because she had nothing else to go on. Now, my next criticism of this, why do you have to go into someone's history to find a point of attack? I mean, that's fine. But if there's no pattern of this behavior, then really what's the point? Like, this is what I'm saying. If you have to go back 35 years into someone's history of what they may have written 30 years ago, if that's your point of attack on somebody, then you don't really have much, do you? I mean, if this is what people are attacking Jeremy Corbyn on, something that was written in a magazine that he wrote for 35 years ago, then there really isn't that much to attack him on, is there? If you can't attack him on policy and why you think his policies are failures, or why they won't work if they're implemented, if that isn't your point of attack, and instead your point of attack is an article that he didn't even write for a magazine that he wrote for 35 years ago, if that's your point of attack, then you don't have anything, do you? Like, for example, take Obama. Now, there are legitimate things to hit Obama on. For example, drone strikes and the amount of people that he deported. But because Fox News wasn't going to hit him on those things, because the right wing liked drone strikes and they liked deporting people, they had to think up new ways to actually hit Obama. So one of them was the birth certificate. They had to go to Obama's birth to try to attack him because they couldn't because Fox News wasn't able to find a real way to actually attack him, because they weren't going to attack him on war or deportations or whistleblowers. And another example is Bernie Sanders. So when Bernie Sanders was running, one of the point of attacks that the Hillary bots, you can call them, did on him was that he wrote about a rape fantasy in the 70s. So let me give you context there. In 1972, Bernie Sanders wrote an essay. And the essay was about gender roles. And the actual point of the essay was attacking the stereotypes of gender roles and questioning those stereotypes. And in those stereotypes was the idea that a woman imagines being raped. And he's at the time feeling out ideas. And maybe it wasn't written out perfectly. It didn't sound proper. But the whole point of the article, if you actually read it, was questioning gender stereotypes, which is fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But they don't have anything else to attack Bernie Sanders on. So they go back in 1972 to find where he wrote down the word rape once in an essay, and all of a sudden that's the point of attack for Bernie Sanders. So this is what I'm talking about. If you're not going to attack somebody on policy, then really who gives a shit? Unless there is a history of that behavior. So a good example of how you can actually go into someone's past and it actually has an effect on today is with Donald Trump. So Donald Trump was hit on his accusations of sexual assault. So that video came out where you can hear him talking about how he grabs a woman by the pussy. And that by itself, sure, you can say it's whatever, locker room talk, it's disgusting, whatever. That by itself isn't really anything to really hit him on too hard. Sure, it sounds bad, but it's possible he was just saying it to try and sound cool, which, by the way, it didn't sound cool. But that's what he may have perceived it as. But then you go into Trump's history and see that, wait, his ex-wife accused him of sexual assault. She later dropped the charges, but those accusations were there. And there have been other people that have accused him of rape and sexual assault. So there's a long history there. So there's actually a reason to go back into his history and see what he did back then that he's still doing now. That makes more sense. And still, I still think it's a lot more effective to hit a politician or a candidate on what their policy proposals are. Because if their policy proposals don't make sense and they don't pan out and people don't want them or whatever it is, that is really why the politician is running, to run on those policies, to enact those policies. So that's really where you should put your focus on. If the Hillary campaign had focused more on Trump's policies or lack thereof, they would have seen a much better result in the election. But these attempts at smearing people with this shit in their history, it's not always effective because people can sense it as smearing. A lot of times they just blow it right off, whether it's true or not, because it's not based on policy. It's not about what the person's going to do once they're in office. Now, the third or the last part I want to get to on this is, was the statement in the magazine that Sophy Ridge mentioned, was it even wrong? Now, again, I already said Jeremy Corbyn had nothing to do with it. He said he had nothing to do with it. But regardless of all that, now, this is the quote that she was referring to. So, in the wake of the bombing by the IRA, the magazine claimed the British only sit up and take notice if they are bombed into it. Now, think about that quote for a second. It doesn't mean it's wrong. Now, yeah, bombing is wrong. That part is wrong. But in terms of the government sitting up and taking notice of an issue, a lot of times they don't notice until it gets as bad as it gets. So Black Lives Matter, for example. Until the Black Lives Matter movement began, there wasn't much focus on how the police treat the black community worse than they treat everybody else. Or an even better example is with mainstream media. So there are protests all the time, but you don't often see them covered unless there's violence. So for example, last year there was a protest called Democracy Spring. Despite the fact that it was the largest sit-in on the Capitol ever, it wasn't covered. Why? Because there was no violence. It was a peaceful protest. And because it was a peaceful protest, it wasn't covered. Now, that statement doesn't mean that you should be violent. It doesn't mean that, just like the statement in the magazine, doesn't mean that you should do bombings. They're simply stating that the government doesn't take notice of an issue until there are bombings. What that statement is supposed to convey is that the government should be noticing these issues before it gets to violence. They should take note of what's happening, whether it's protest movements or whatever. Before it gets to violence, the media and government should sit up and take notice. So there's always this rush to just paint someone with a broad brush without actually looking at the statement and thinking, what does the statement actually mean? Is it wrong? Why do I think I have a problem with it? And what is the intention of the writer? Now, I would respond to Sophy Ridge there and ask her, do you think the intention of the writer was to encourage bombings? Because I don't think it comes off that way. Simply pointing out a reality that people don't take notice of something until there's violence doesn't mean you're calling for violence. And just in general, when you go back into someone's history and try to pull things out, people grow and change. So think of who you were 10 or 20 years ago. Do you have the same politics now that you did back then? Do you believe the same things, all the same things now as you did back then? I'd wager that most of us don't. There are actually very few exceptions. People like Bernie Sanders, who their entire life have been extremely consistent, whether it's on gay rights, where he was pro-gay rights in the 1970s, or economic inequality, or whatever it is. Very few people have that sort of record. So we really need to stop trying to demonize people who grow and change and evolve as they get older. Isn't that kind of the point of the human existence? As we get older, we learn more, we grow, And that's perfectly okay. So if you're going to try and attack people running for office, try and attack them on their policies first. Because really, that's what's going to end up affecting citizens the most.